words?
Yep. Thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate the invitation. I was up early May with a group called the Coast Defense Study Group, a group that I've been involved with, and Steve Lyons. I got involved in this as well. And you're still a member, right? I don't know if you paid your dues. They keep sending me the $40. Yeah, okay. So we had 60 people from all over the world. We had people from Australia and Norway. And so in what they do is they study coastal defenses of all of major nations going back hundreds and hundreds of years. And they like to come to the New England area to look at the great defenses out here, going back Revolutionary War, Civil War, the Endicott period forts, and World War I, World War II. That's when they all came basically to an end with the development of aircraft and jet aircraft and missiles. And you got just unbelievable history out here. But, you know, since I was a little kid, I grew up in Massachusetts, and we always had a cottage on Cape Cod, little cottage. But I remember as a kid being fascinated by some of the older gentlemen that my father had befriended, and would come around and tell us about the German U-boat operations off the coast and how they would see the horizon lit up by red and yellow lights, and they heard explosions off in the distance. And then detritus, flotsam and jetsam would come up on the beaches, occasionally bodies and so forth. And I was fascinated. I couldn't believe as a kid that, wow, World War II was right here on our shore. Not only that, World War I, a lot of people don't know, World War I was heavily fought by German U-boats in the Gulf of Maine. And so as a kid, I became fascinated with this, and I got my certification as a technical wreck diver. I got certified in 1978 when I was freshman in high school, when I started diving wrecks off the New England coast. And then I got fascinated with the entire war and German U-boat operations. Over the years, I studied all of the U-boat operations in the Battle of the Atlantic, concentrating on the New England coast. And I was fascinated at how much activity was out here, and nobody knew about it because the press was under strict limitations on what they could tell the public until basically it was May 9th, after Germany's official surrender, May 7th of 1945. And then all of a sudden the papers were covered with German U-boat activities and so forth, but they were under strict limitations that they couldn't print this stuff. And as all great stories start in a bar room among friends, I was teaching classes, and I had done post-war battle assessments for the U.S. Navy on some of the cold cases of warships and aircraft that were lost during the war. And we have two incredible cases here. We have the Eagle 56. We also have the loss of an airship in 1944, the K-14. And that anniversary is coming up, the 80th anniversary next year. And there's going to be a lot written about that. There was a lot of speculation about that being enemy action as well. And I'm not going to spoil that story, but I was sitting with a couple of friends of mine, Brockton firemen, and they told me that they had always wanted to dive a German U-boat off of Block Island, U-853, which I had dove on many times. They thought that submarine had sank their father's ship and killed their father. And I said, what are you talking about? The U-853 was not credited with, was your father a merchant mariner on the Black Point? I said, there was only one U.S. Navy armed guard, and his name was not Westerland. They said, no, he was on a ship called the Eagle off of Portland, Maine in 45. So that doesn't register. I know every single combat operation, particularly New England waters. I don't know what you're talking about. So I went, and I said, I thought I met your father. Well, it was their stepfather, who was a combat veteran from World War II, who married their mother, who had been widowed during the war. I was a little kid. I didn't put two and two together. So I went back and started checking into it, and it led to one of the craziest stories in U.S. naval history, because it never happened before, and it's never going to happen again in my lifetime. The official change of the causality of the loss of an American warship And it was a complete cover-up for 56 years, which is pretty strange because this happens to be the boat numbered the 56. And it happened right off the coast here. And I've been up here over and over again, repeatedly for the last 20 years, searching for the ship, meeting with families, coming up, working with Steve to put up. I missed the last monument. I couldn't come up here because of COVID restrictions. So Steve did all the legwork in getting that second monument put out here. But I just want to thank a couple of people. Steve, a guy I had not met. We've been talking for the last 7 years. I've been driving this guy crazy. And I wanted to meet him in May, and we came up, and you know, you were kind of undergoing some medical treatment or something at that time, I think, and we couldn't get together. And but Bob Dodd as well, and Gene Gross, I believe we had met from the museum, in Jim Rowe, who I had met over at the museum that you guys just invited me to. And when I saw the incredible diorama, is that what you call it? Massive. Yeah, Bob made that. And I was up there. I said, this is incredible. This is so accurate. And he said, look up there. I look, yeah, taking my glasses up. He said, that's the Eagle 56 coming out of Portland. And I looked, I said, it's an Eagle boat, perfectly scale. It's about that big. And then he says, look up there. And on the top right is a scale model of the U-853, Type 9 CU boat. It was like, unbelievable. So I've been telling the families and so forth, and the guys from the Coast Defense Study Group were absolutely blown away with the stuff. I was as well. A museum, you have a great historical group of people who are history buffs up here, who are keeping the history alive. That's the problem. It's not. I mean, you live in an area that's just so rich in history, and you know, you have to keep the history alive. You have to tell your children, your grandchildren, let them know what a great asset you have. I'm not going to keep on going on. I'm going to go right into it. We have, this is the subject that we're here for tonight. This is the sinking of the USS Eagle, PE-56, silent victim of the U-853, happened on Monday, April 23rd, 1945. The vessel we have seen here, kind of an ugly looking ship. It was an Eagle class subchaser. They called them patrol escorts. And they were designed in World War I to hunt down German U-boats. They were contracted, 60 manufacturer contract for the Ford Motor Company in Dearborn, Michigan. They were the first assembly line warships ever manufactured on a rail line. And they were pre-manufactured sections, and if you look at it, everything is slab-sided. It looks like a shoebox if you're looking down on it, but it has a knife-like bow. And they were 200 feet, 9 inches long. They weighed about 500 tons. They had a complement of about 62 men. They were armed with 2 4-inch deck guns, one fore and aft. They had a 3-inch anti-aircraft gun, which was antiquated by the time they were manufactured. They had depth charge racks on the back with 10 depth charges each. And they did have sonar, and the bow, if you look here, is a very, the bow is 90 degrees to the angle, to the water line. So they were actually, the idea, and it's kind of crazy, was if you can pick up the submarine on the early sonar and depth charge it to the surface, if you can't outgun it, you ram it. And so I'm going to show you later on, there are photographs of the ship. It's so, you can't tell here, but it's very narrow and knife-like. And the forward compartment here, they actually filled with cement to turn it basically into a giant cleaver. So the idea was bring it to the surface, just ram it, cut the thing in half. And if they ever had an opportunity to do it, it would probably work pretty well. They never did. These were manufactured in the very end of World War I, so they didn't see any action in World War I. This particular 56 out of the 60 wasn't commissioned until 1919. And by World War II, because they didn't see action in World War I, World War II, there were only 8 left, and they were pretty much relegated to non-combat activities and coastal patrol stuff. And this Eagle 56 was used. First, it went down to the DC area, and it was operating out of Chesapeake Bay, and then she'd do regular operations to Hamilton, Bermuda, and Key West. And at that time, at the early days of World War II, actually probably saw her greatest activity. She was towing targets for a secret weapon called a Type 24 acoustic homing torpedo called Fido. And I talked to the crew, and they didn't know what it was. They said, we used to go out there, they'd send us out, they'd drop a tiny little torpedo. It used to follow us around and bang off the side of the ship. Well, they weren't allowed to talk to anyone about it because it was the first air-delivered acoustic homing torpedo of the war. But that was around 43, 44, and then they were sent back up here to the New England area. I'm sorry, I thought this was my remote control. So this is what these ships look like. They were called Henry Ford's Ugly Ducklings. Like I said, there wasn't really a clean line on them. They were just built like boxes. And as I said, they had a standard complement of 62 men. And they were claimed to do 18 knots. I don't think any one of these things, unless it was going over, a dam, was ever making 18 knots. This is a change of command ceremony. This is March, I believe March of 1945. I believe this was January. It was 3 months before her loss in April. And this is a change of command ceremony. And Lieutenant Commander Barr was changing over command to Lieutenant Commander Early. And this gentleman, so this is in South Portland. And this is Lieutenant Scagnelli. He was the engineering officer. He comes into play here because he was the engineering officer. He was responsible for all the machinery on the ship, the boiler room, the engine room, and that comes into play later on. But this is the change of command ceremony. Lieutenant Commander Barr wanted to be replaced, and he wanted to be sent to the Pacific because they knew it was the final days of the war. It was within 12 days of Germany's surrender, or 14 days of Germany's surrender, 2 weeks. Hitler, they knew, was surrounded in Berlin. The Russians were sieging Berlin, and everyone was just waiting the clock to tick down whether they were going to capture Hitler or whatever was going to happen. But they knew the war in Europe was just about over. And Barr was hot. He wanted to see some action. So he said, I'm not going to see any action here because at that time, the only thing they were doing, they were towing targets out in Casco Bay for aircraft out of the Brunswick Naval Air Station that were dropping sand-filled bombs. So they'd leave Portland early in the morning, 8 o'clock in the morning. They'd go out and they'd spend the entire day towing these floating targets at the end of a 500-yard cable. And the target they described to me, I had never heard of before. Usually they'll have these targets with a couple of spars and it basically looks like a sail. These guys said, no, there were a couple of 55-gallon drums that were welded together and it was painted green. And I've never seen one. I've never seen one set, but they all agreed that's what it was. And they called it the pickle because it looked like a pickle. It had an end cap on each end. And I'm not sure what this was supposed to represent. My idea is that it was supposed to look like or resemble the snorkel head on the latest German snorkel-fitted submarines, which would have presented a very small target on the surface. So that's what I suspect. They were not familiar with that or what they were using as a target, but that's the only thing I can think of. It was too small to be a conning tower, it was clearly too small to be a submarine. It would have been a very small target. It would have left a big wake, a lot of suds in the water, so it would have been visible, but so that's what they were doing every day. They'd leave at 8 o'clock. They'd come back around 4 or 5 in the afternoon, and they were towing this target. And so Commander Early is the new commander who takes over. This is a photograph of the so-called Black Gang. And so these are the guys who work in the boiler room and the engine room. And this is Lieutenant Scagnelli right here. He's the engineering officer. He was the only survivor from the bow section where all the officers were in the bow. This is John Breeze, who was working at the time. He had just assumed watch before just left watch before the ship exploded. And this is Harold Peterson. John Breeze came from Washington State. Harold Peterson came from upstate New York. At the time I got involved in this case in 1998, there were the only 3 living survivors of the 13 men who survived this disaster. This is a German U-boat. It's a Type 9 C-40 U-boat. This is the U-853. This is after her commissioning. This is as she's departing Stavanger, Norway. And this was a relatively long range. They had two major classes of submarines. A Type 7, which was a relatively short range class submarine, had a range of about 7,500 miles. These had a range of a little over 12,000 miles, and these are the ones that did the most damage off the American Northeast coast. These are the ones that didn't require mid-ocean refueling by the so-called milch cows. So they could come over and loiter off the American East Coast for about a month at a time. And she had a 55-man crew. And you'll notice she's missing most people think a German U-boat has a big forward deck gun. And they did early in the war. They did until about mid-1943. They called it Black May. And, the Type 7 boats had an 88 millimeter deck gun right here. The Type 9s like this actually had a 105 millimeter. But by that time in May, our anti-submarine operations, weapon systems, convoys, and so forth were so extensive that the Germans they no longer were the hunters, they became the hunted. And the U-boat losses at that time changed dramatically. So they realized it was very dangerous to surface and outgun ships on the surface, that they changed their ploy to basically using torpedoes in a submarine, in a submerged attack, which was much more expensive, much more costly, but they were losing so many submarines at that time that it made sense. What they did is they increased the size of the back of the conning tower. There were two platforms here called winter gardens, which they put on massive anti-aircraft guns, 37 and 20 millimeter anti-aircraft guns, but multiple batteries, multiple guns, so they could throw up a massive amount of flak in case there were aircraft that came out to attack them. And this is her leaving Stavanger, Norway. This is early April of 45. Now, some of the U-boats you would remember had these crazy looking conning tower emblems, and there were something that was just a matter of honor for the crew to have their own logos, and they were not sanctioned by the Kriegsmarine. The Kriegsmarine wanted nothing of indicia on their submarines for obvious reasons. If an aircraft or a surface vessel sees a submarine, can identify it by any marking on the submarine, anywhere on the submarine, and then somebody sees it somewhere else, they can now track the direction it's going. And so it was not sanctioned by the Kriegsmarine. And early in the war, before Germany started the war, the Japanese started the war, you'd see old photographs of the smaller class submarines that had big white numbers on them. They did have those. Those were removed by the time Germany entered the war for obvious reasons. And then you'd see after the war, you'd see submarines with a big U and a number after those. Those were submarines that were surrendered to the United States and the British, those were painted on by the Allies for bringing to friendly ports for basically selling victory bonds at the end of the war. So they'd bring them along to coastal cities, Boston, New York, and those were where you'd see the photographs, but they did not have any of that on their boats during the war. But they were allowed, when they did leave port, they'd send a guy with a couple of paint cans up with some artistic ability, and he'd put up a conning tower emblem. Not on all boats, but some boats. And this particular boat had a very unique conning tower insignia. It was this red trotting horse on a yellow shield, which is the obverse of a Ferrari emblem, which is a yellow horse on a red shield. The strange thing was, this is only one of about a half dozen emblems that I have ever seen that actually had the number of the boat on it. And that comes into play later on. It also comes into play because there are witness statements after this submarine attacks where this is actually seen. So this is a commissioning ceremony in Germany of this boat. And you can see this is before they put the guns in here. They had 20 millimeter, quad 20 millimeter, and twin 37 millimeter guns up here. This you're going to see later on. This is a flagstaff. That piece of wood, it has a knob on the end. You're going to see that later on, and I'm going to bring that up. But this is the commissioning ceremony. This is the commissioning officer, Helmut Sommer, who this boat only saw 2 operational patrols. It was at sea many other times because it was going back and forth to flak training and from one port to have repairs done because it was hit by a bomb at one point and had damage to it. but it only went out on 2 operational patrols. The first operational patrol was basically a weather reporting operation in which this submarine was strafed by aircraft, Allied aircraft, and Helmut Sommer was badly wounded by 50 caliber fragments. He was replaced by this young 23-year-old commander, Helmut Framsdorf. And they claim Helmut Framsdorf is over 6 feet tall. It's hard to tell. They tried to recruit smaller guys because if you've ever been inside a submarine, you can go to the Museum of Science and Industry, the U-505. If you're 6 feet, you're going to be banging your head all over the place. And they weren't wearing helmets, so these guys must have had welts all over their heads. But he was 23 years old at the time that he took command in March of 1945. This is Helmut Framsdorf. And this is a recreation I did early on, trying to track by known sightings of the submarine, areas that we knew where she was operating when she came into the Gulf of Maine. And this is her first sighting is off of Portland when she sank the Eagle 56. The next day, she was attacked off of Monhegan Island, then off of Penobscot Bay. The following day, she was sighted in the mid-Gulf of Maine. So it's May 23rd, May 24th, May 25th, May 26th, May 29th off the backside of Cape Cod, May 5th right off of Block Island. This is the Eagle 56. This is, I don't know who did this. This is a composite photo. I think this was done by Lone Wolf Productions. It did a recent documentary in 2019 after we located the wreck of the Eagle 56, but it's a very good, with the exception of, I'll tell you right now, it did have the 4-inch deck gun. They had removed the 4-inch deck gun here in years before. It did not have this compass binnacle was gone. The 3-inch deck gun had long been gone, so that's completely missing. This is completely missing, and this was replaced by a 50 caliber water-cooled heavy machine gun. So what happened is, from all accounts that I later found, it was Monday, May 23rd, 1945. She was ready to conduct her standard operations of leaving Portland at 8:00 a.m. and going out to training, spar training area Obo in Casco Bay, just off the coast, a little northwest, I think, of the Portland headlight. Gulf of Maine, what'd I say? Yeah, Casco Bay, Gulf of Maine. You know, Steve, I'm listening to Steve. He's the one that corrected. So you have to use this terminology. So they went out and they were towing targets all morning long, and then they had their change of watch. So they had a 4-hour watch, and so the men were out conducting exercises for 4 hours, and then they stopped for some reason, dead stop, which was not according to any order that I had ever read. I mean, it's really not bright to do. There were other ships in the area. There was the Nantucket Lightship, the LV-112, which was at that time had been taken over and was acting as the Portland Gate examination vessel. So it was Coast Guard manned, and they had painted it from red when it was off Nantucket as a lightship. They painted it gray. They blacked out all of the portholes. They removed the radio direction equipment, the reflectors, the lights, and everything else, the foghorns, and they armed it with a 3-inch deck gun on the stern. They had 250 caliber machine guns, and it was standing out there at a fixed position that was guarding the approaches to Portland, Maine. So that was standing by. There were a couple of other warships in the area. There was a destroyer, the USS Selfridge, which was conducting sound training exercises off of Halfway Rock, where the Navy had sunk a month before an old patrol submarine, American submarine that they were using as a sound target to train their sonar men. And that was heading in. And the Eagle 56 was standing by about 6 or 8 miles offshore. And they put down noon chow, which it seemed every day the noon chow was the same. It was Franks and beans. And a lot of these guys were sitting around. They were smoking cigarettes and they were playing board games. It's freezing cold outside. The water's 38 degrees. And this shows the ship in the appropriate configuration. It only has a 4-inch deck gun. The compass stand had been removed, and the 4-inch deck gun back here had been removed by a 50 caliber machine gun. There is no 3-inch gun. They do have the deck charge racks, but this is based on the witness accounts and from the accounts that I got from the Nantucket Lightship personnel, that at 14 minutes past noon, a tremendous explosion occurred, and it was heard miles away. They heard it 9 miles away, and it lifted the ship 3 feet out of the water, snapped it in two amidships, right behind the bridge, right in the area of the engine room, right between the engine room and the boiler room, and through a water column 300 feet in the air, which they said persisted for as much as 20 seconds, according to Gus Emro, who was the commander of the Nantucket. He said he had seen depth charges, he had seen torpedoes go off, he had never seen a water column like this, so the amount of equipment and machinery thrown into the air. And the fact that it lifted the ship out of the water is an automatic indication in and of itself that it was an external underwater explosion. An explosion inside the ship does not lift a ship out of the water. That's just, it's common sense to a naval architect or engineer. But so it bust the ship into, and as I said, the entire bow, the officers were accommodated in the bow section. The crew, the enlisted men, were mostly in the stern. And this is a similar ship with a similar, this is a conventional torpedo. In conventional torpedoes, the explosives are not that much different nowadays than they were in 1945. TNT, aluminum flakes. It was Torpex composition, which is about 600 to 700 pounds of high explosive. And this is a similar size ship. This is a very small ship, also a little over 200 feet. And that's blowing a 300-foot water column. You see the massive amounts of the superstructure that's being blown into the air. And this is a composite that was done by the Smithsonian Channel in their documentary they did in 2019 after we finally found the ship. And as I said, this configuration, which was for canopies and so forth, that was missing. There were some certain things that they did in this documentary that were not historically accurate. They still had the deck gun on and so forth, but it was a pretty good, the simulations weren't that bad. So I mentioned there was one destroyer that was only a few miles away, and it was heading back into the harbor defenses. This is USS Selfridge, and they heard the loud explosion. They immediately sounded general quarters. They headed to the location to start conducting rescue operations. This is a photograph that was actually taken of the Selfridge as she's coming into Grand Trunk Pier, and at the time it was the largest ship without coming in without the assistance of a harbor tug or a harbor pilot. And at this particular point, they have the survivors on board. And I'm sorry, this is a photograph that was taken from one of the Selfridge men with a Brownie camera. And these guys are coming up to 38 degrees. And you can see, normally the water would have been a lot heavier, but there's thousands of gallons of diesel fuel in the water. And if you know anything about, a lot of times they dump diesel fuel to quell the waves and rescue operations. These guys are saturated in diesel fuel as they're being helped up the ship. Now, there were probably 36 men from the stern. There was only one survivor from the bow, John Scagnelli, and I'm going to show you an illustration of how they described what happened to the ship, the two parts of the ship as they started going down. The stern went down at kind of a 45-degree angle. The weight of the machinery in the bow section caused the ship to go immediately perpendicular, and that's why only one man was able to make it out. So all the men in the bow of the ship went down with it. So they're conducting rescue operations when there is a sonar man on the Selfridge who calls up to the commanding officer. He says, I have a solid contact, a sound contact. He says, I can hear screws and the blowing of ballast tank. There's a submarine out there. So they had a Commodore on board who, because they were just about to leave Portland, they were going to go down to Norfolk, Virginia to escort a convoy to Iran. And the commanding officer and the Commodore aboard had an argument on who was in authority, who was in charge. The commander prevailed. He said, look, I've got over 400 men on board this ship. We're a sitting duck. And if that's a submarine, they can put a fish in us, and that's not going to happen. So they determined the sound contact was about 1,200 yards away, and he ordered that they immediately break off rescue operations to go out and conduct depth charge attack, which they did, much to the horror. So they put down a motor dory and a lifeboat in the water to continue to pull these guys out. Now, the USS Nantucket had at this time made it on scene, and they started rescue operations as well, and they pulled one body out of the water. It was either a seaman named Napper Nugent, who was dead, and they also pulled Harold Peterson, the guy from New York, out of the water and saved his life. But the rest of the other 12 survivors were all taken aboard the Selfridge. But the Selfridge breaks off rescue operations, as I mentioned, to the horror of the men who were watching over the side. As they start turning the screws, they see survivors getting sucked into the prop wash and killed right in front of them. I'm reading the accounts. It's like, shocking stuff, but it's war. So they immediately go off. They drop 13 magnetic depth charges and looped around to conduct the second attack when the harbor entrance control post ordered them to immediately go back, retrieve the motor dory and the lifeboat, and to head back to the Grand Trunk Naval Dispensary to deliver the survivors. At the same time, HECP were putting together a comprehensive hunt-to-kill task group of 3 destroyers, 3 destroyer escorts, I believe 4 patrol frigates, 5 PBY-5A Catalinas, 2 or 3 Vega Ventura aircraft, and they started to now search for what they knew was a German U-boat out there. They later changed their story. They denied it. No U-boat, blew up your own ship. But they knew, and they put together a hunt-to-kill task group, and they were out there within hours, and they hunted this submarine for the next 12 days. So this is a typical depth charge attack. That's probably a 50 or 75 footer. I mean, you're dropping 300 pounds of high explosive, and these things, you're rolling them off the racks in the back, and then you're firing them off the K and Y guns to the side. Standard pattern is 13 depth charges. They set them generally, well, at different depths, usually 25 foot depth settings. And they're working with their sonar men to give them a bearing and an idea of how deep the submarine might be operating when they're dropping the depth charges. Meanwhile, they bring these men, the survivors. This is called the Lucky 13. There were 12 men here. These are the enlisted men. And these are at the Grand Trunk Naval Dispensary. And John Breeze is, where's John Breeze? There's John Breeze right there from Washington State. And there's Harold Peterson. And these are 2 of the last living survivors who I was able to interview. They were kept separately from the officer, John Scagnelli, the engineering officer, who was in charge of all these men. And they had just been relieved of watch 14 minutes before the ship exploded. So this comes into play because when they are relieved of watch, they were responsible for recording all of the machinery that they were working on. So they had logbooks, and when they were being relieved of watch, they tested, checked off the water levels, the temperatures, the vacuums, all of the critical specifications to the operation of the machinery that they were working on. And then when the men who came on to relieve them came on watch, they had to do the same thing. So duplicate testing by different people were done within 14 minutes of the time the ship exploded. The other part of the story is that only 10 days earlier, this ship was in Rockland, Maine, undergoing a complete overhaul in which it was taken out of the water. They pressure tested the boilers. They looked at the boilers for caustic embrittlement, any type of metal fatigue. And these were low pressure boilers. They're called Thornycroft Express boilers that worked on an operating pressure, maximum pressure of only 250 pounds PSI. Now, there were destroyers that work on pressures well over 1,000, 1,500 pounds. These are low pressure boilers, and they use a steam turbine, which is like a jet engine that uses steam. So they tested them, I think, up to 375 pounds PSI. And Scagnelli later testified. He said, 10 days earlier, we checked out everything. The ship was in perfect operating condition. And at this time, these are relatively modern warships. Boiler explosions were things that happened in the 1870s, 1880s with old-fashioned technology. These did not generally happen. I've challenged people to come up with it. I talked to people at Gibson Cox at the time, forensic engineers and men who work in that area, and they said it's physically impossible, couldn't happen. No, number one. Number two, if it had failed, it might have blown the ventilators off in the boiler room, but it would not have broken the ship in two, and it certainly wouldn't have lifted it out of the water. It's physically impossible. So Scagnelli was in charge of the engineering compartment at the time, and he had to carry this with him for the rest of his life because he was responsible for sending out letters to all the men, the families of the men who were killed, and he was not allowed to say anything disputing the boiler theory. So he went on for 56 years with the guilt of having a negligent crew blow up their own ship and kill 49 of their own crewmen. So the conning tower insignia comes back into play again because the men, as they're in the Grand Trunk Naval Dispensary, they were supposedly had gone through a court of inquiry. That didn't happen. I actually interviewed a lady who was the Alice Hyde Hultgren, who was a legal yeoman in the Wave. She was 21 years old. She was the one who went around with a young naval officer who went through JAG training. He'd had no understanding, according to her, of any machinery or anything on the ship. She said, I don't think this guy had ever been on board a ship. He was a 90-day wonder. They took these kids out of the Midwest. They put them through 90 days of training so they knew what uniforms looked like, who to salute and who has to salute you. That's basically what they did. And these guys went in and asked very informal questions, but completely avoided. When the guys started talking about what they saw and that they thought they were torpedoed, we're not talking anything about torpedoes. It was a boiler explosion. Do you understand? So there was no court of inquiry. They never went into a courtroom. There was no tribunal. There was no cross-examination. All of this was informal questioning while they were in their beds, held incommunicado at the Grand Trunk Naval Dispensary for 10 days until Germany's surrender 2 weeks later. And that's according to Alice Hyde Hultgren. That's according to the 3 survivors, and I believe them. So there was a guy named David Geronik, who was a seaman first class, who they were asking questions, and incredibly, this ended up in the transcript. And they were trying to, no, you don't say that. He says, yeah, well, and John Breeze was one of, I think, 5 or 6 men that said as they were on the stern of the ship, just about to jump off. Now, the ship is going down amidships, so they climbed up the depth charge tracks. None of these men had the time to put on warm weather clothes, life jackets, or anything else. The water's 38 degrees, freezing cold outside. They're now in freezing cold water. Half of these guys didn't even have shoes on. John Breeze told me when the explosion happened, he was thrown up above to the overhead, hit his head, was almost knocked out, was launched out of his shoes. So he's out there in bare feet in freezing cold water. And he said, as we're on the stern, one of his friends said, hey, Breeze, look, there's a submarine. And they looked and they all said it was 500 or 600 yards away. A submarine broached the surface. They all described it as all black. And Daniel Geronik said, I stared at it for several seconds and I saw red or yellow markings. Now, I don't know if it was red and yellow. It might have been a mistranscript because you can't mix red or yellow. It's either red and yellow. And I asked Alice, and she said, you know, it had been so long, it might have been red and yellow. But it was incredible. I said red and yellow because then I had gotten from the German archives, I knew what the conning tower in this particular submarine was. I said, that's a pretty incredible statement. Well, they didn't know, but it's going to come in later on as well. So as I mentioned, the submarine is now attacked the following day off of Monhegan Island. It was attacked the day after that off of Penobscot Bay. So it was attacked that afternoon on the 24th that it sank the Eagle 56. They tracked it north. They attacked it the following day on the 27th. I'm sorry, the 24th, the 25th, the 26th off of Penobscot Bay. The 27th, it was picked up by a PBY-5A flying boat in the mid-Gulf of Maine, surfaced, ventilating. They attacked it at that time. The submarine dove. And then 3 days later on the 29th, I think it was Sunday the 29th, it was sighted by an aircraft out of the Quonset Naval Air Station in Rhode Island, surfaced 10 miles due east of Wellfleet, Cape Cod, heading south, ventilating in broad daylight. It was a training flight, so they were unarmed. So he was only able to radio it in to vector other warships to the area. The submarine then dove, and it was a snorkel-fitted submarine, so they can stay underwater for long periods of time. And so we know that now it's heading south. In the operational patrol areas of this submarine from the Kriegsmarine initially were to operate and sink any Allied shipping between Halifax, Nova Scotia, and New York. So we know it was heading south. Now it's off the backside of Cape Cod. Now it's in Block Island Sound. And I only found out a couple of years ago after I wrote the first book that there was another training flight out of Brunswick Naval Air Station when they were working with U.S. Navy patrol subs to identify submarines out of New London, Connecticut. This patrol flight was southwest of Block Island, so it was off of Montauk, New York. Montauk in New York and Block Island is only 14 miles. Southwest of Block Island, heading northeast towards Block Island, they come out of a fog bank and they see a submarine. At first, they thought it was an American fleet submarine that they were supposed to be looking for and report. But he said, we flew over, and as soon as I looked at it, I knew it was an American submarine. He said it had a laundry basket shaped configuration of railings behind the conning tower. And that's typical of what I showed you earlier, the Winter Garden, which is 2 levels of gun platforms after the conning tower, in which they had massive 20 millimeter and 37 millimeter guns. And so he said, I knew it was German. We immediately raced back. We were under radio silence, so they headed back to Quonset Naval Air Station. They got out, they ran to the officer in charge, and they were interviewed for 3 hours before the officer in charge felt that it was a non-sub contact, that they were crazy, they didn't see what they saw. Well, 7 hours later, they were proven not crazy because it was heading up to the shipping approaches, which it did with the approaches to Portland, Maine. It was heading to the shipping approaches to Newport, Rhode Island. And that's where it was 7 hours later, right off of Point Judith, Rhode Island. And this is a Sprague coal collier, Sprague steamship company that you have up here, seeing it right up here. Is still in operation. This is a 5,700 ton ship, a little over 400 feet, carrying over 7,000 tons of soft bituminous coal from Virginia. And it's heading up in the intercoastal waterways. So it's heading at only about 8 knots, and it's heading towards Buzzards Bay. It's going to go through Cape Cod Canal, and then it's going to go up to Boston to the General Electric power plant at L Street. We've all seen that. It's still there, big tower. So that was this regular operating area. It would just bring up and fuel that plant. And it's 3.5 miles southeast of Point Judith, Rhode Island. So it's within the coastal defenses of all of Narragansett Bay. I mean, there's Fort Weatherall had 16, I think, disappearing 16-inch guns, not disappearing guns. They had 2 guns right at 16-inch guns, encasements like they do out here at the, what's the island out here? Steve, Peaks Island, yeah. You know, the casements that they have, they're 500 feet away from each other, big cement casements. They have those right at Point Judith. And they're inland as well. They're a good distance inland, but they have all kinds of. Fort Weatherall, I think, had smaller guns, but still could reach out many miles. And this was clearly within the defenses of Newport Harbor. So it's 5:35, I think, p.m. This is May 5th. So it's nice and sunny out. There are other ships in the area. There was a tugboat pulling several schooner barges. There was a Yugoslavian freighter called the Carmen, which was very close by. And all of a sudden, it's 5:35 p.m., and she's heading northeast towards Cape Cod Canal, when all of a sudden a massive explosion hits her right here, 40 feet off the stern. And she had deck guns, which were manned by U.S. Navy gun crew. And so it hits right around the area of her drive reduction gears and the propellers, which are the noisiest part of the ship. So it sounds to me a lot like the Eagle 56. It hit the loudest part of the ship. So it indicates to me it could have been a German acoustic torpedo. They called it a Type 5. So it's a torpedo that picks up the sound of a ship and attacks the loudest part. So it explodes here, sends the large column of water up, splits the ship in 2, and sends her down in short order with 11 crewmen and 1 U.S. Navy armed guard. So the men who 7 hours earlier had reported the submarine that had been dismissed as a hallucination. If the Hunter-Killer Task Group that I'm going to mention now, I think it was Hunter-Killer Group 60.7, was made up of 5 or 7 ships, a couple of destroyers, one destroyer, a couple of destroyer escorts, patrol frigates, were in the area just heading in to the west end of the Cape Cod Canal. And they were heading to Boston. They were going to go up to the Boston Navy Yard to refit. And then they were going to come back. They had just left off elements of a convoy, I believe, in Norfolk, Virginia. So they were in close proximity. They were 15, 20 miles away. They immediately got the SOS. They turn around at flank speed, sound general quarters. They start going after the culprit. Ships don't just explode. U-boats make ship explode. So now we have another hunter-killer group. So we still have elements of the hunter-killer group 60.3 from the Gulf of Maine who are still in the area. They're still hours away, but they're out there and they're heading down to this area. And then you have elements of 60.7 who are now heading, and they're very close, and they're going to be here within hours. So this is 8 o'clock that evening, or before 8 o'clock. They're there within a couple of hours. These are actually probably photos taken from the next morning, May 6th. And this is the Coast Guard manned, this is a patrol frigate called the Mibrary. And the USS Atherton is an American destroyer escort that's out here. And they were all dropping massive amounts of ordnance. Now, the submarine was caught in shallow water, 130 feet, and very flat bottom topography. So it wasn't like the coast of Maine with really rocky bottom topography. The submarine can go to the bottom and just sit there and you can't see it because it's mixed in with all the rocks. The sonar equipment at the time is very rudimentary. So they didn't have side scan sonar. So if a submarine went in the bottom, unless it was sticking out like it is here, flat sandy bottom, you got a submarine in the bottom. Very easy to pick up. They picked it up right away. And they started dropping patterns of depth charges. And this is a pattern of what are called hedgehogs. These are fired off the bow of the ship. This is the bow up here. And what happens is the sonar man takes over the con or the direction steering the ship. And as they're approaching the submarine at a point about 300 yards away, they fire this battery. It's a big block of these things that look like mortar rounds. There are 24 of them. They weigh 65 pounds. They have a 35-pound shape charge warhead. And they're fired about 270 yards ahead of the ship in an elliptical or circular pattern. And when they hit the water, they sink very rapidly through the water. And when they hit something, they detonate on impact. Sometimes they will countermine. So if one goes off, sometimes others will go off. But you'll see these are each individual splash patterns from each one of those 24 hedgehog mortars. And so what he's doing is they just attacked the submarine that was in front of them. Now they're pulling off to the side so they don't go over if they countermine and would damage the ship, which was happening earlier because the submarine's in such shallow water. They're dropping depth charges in 130 feet of water that are set for like 100 feet, 75 feet. So they're going off within very close proximity, dangerous proximity of the ships that are causing problems because they're damaging sensitive equipment on the ships. They're damaging sound gear, electronics, they're breaking gauge glasses, and they're knocking guys off their feet, and steam pipes are rupturing and so forth. So they decided they're just going to kill this. This is the last submarine. I'll go back. I'm sorry, I jumped ahead of myself. May 4th, the day before the sinking of the Black Point, Karl Dönitz had radioed to all German U-boats to cease hostile action against Allied shipping. Because April 30th, 4 days earlier, Hitler had committed suicide. He married his friend Eva Braun in their bunker in Berlin, and they committed suicide. So now Karl Dönitz had been his hand-chosen successor. So Karl Dönitz is now the second Fuhrer of the Third Reich, and it's 2 days before he's going to surrender. This is 1 day before. This is May 6th. He surrenders the following day. But on May 4th, they radioed to all German U-boats, cease hostile action against Allied shipping, surface, fly a black flag from your periscope, which the commanders took as an insult because a black flag is indicia of piracy, to radio your positions to the nearest Allied naval forces and to surrender. And there were also under orders that weren't conveyed at that time, but to discharge all secret documents, their Enigma machines, their courier burst transmitters, to get rid of their Type 5 acoustic homing torpedoes, anything else of secret nature to discharge and get rid of so they weren't captured by the Allies. So at this point, the Americans know the Germans were supposed to have surrendered. This guy is he's a fanatical Nazi who's not going to give up. We have to put an end to this. So they decided they were just going to drop as much ordnance in this submarine as they could. So over the next 16 hours, they conducted, I believe, 20 hedgehog and depth charge attacks, which the total that I calculated on the amount of ordnance came out to 30 tons of explosives that they dropped on the submarine, till literally commander's cap and chart table were brought to the surface. So they gave this submarine the biggest beating I've ever seen. And one of the crazy reports was the Mibrary. Now, this is the Atherton. She's standing off here effectuating repairs because what the captain was doing is he's ordering the con. He's telling them we're going to go right over a sinking pattern of hedgehogs. They're not veering away like they are here on the Mibrary. They're going off to the side. He was going right over the sinking pattern and dropping 13 magnetic depth charges that were lifting the ship out of the water, blowing gauge glasses, damaging their steering gear, and blowing steam pipes. So now the ship is disabled and they're effectuating repairs out here. So the reports that I read were, they said, this guy's crazy, he can't be doing it. Well, he said, I'm going to kill this sucker. And so they're also at the time, this is one of two ZNP type K blimps from the Weymouth Naval Air Station that came up from New Jersey. And they were operating out here. So this is a photograph of the actual attack. That's the Mibrary right here. And no, I'm sorry, that's the Atherton. It's a destroyer escort, a Buckley class destroyer escort. And you can see she's dropping 13 magnetic depth charges. And so these are taken from the blimps. And the blimps are also dropping sonobuoys that are recording rhythmic hammering. So the men are still, there were 5 compartments inside a Type 9C, and you can lock down the individual compartments. They had already blown open the control room. There were giant holes in it. And that's what brought the commander's cap and the stuff that I'll show you later on to the surface. Those guys are dead. Guys probably in the torpedo rooms and other compartments are sitting there trying to stop the water from coming in. And so they're banging away. They can hear the banging. They drop smoke floats and dye markers on the submarine. They use what's called MAD, magnetic anomaly detection equipment. So they fly over. It's basically an airborne magnetic detection gear. And as they're right over the strongest ferrous magnetic signature, they know the submarine's right there. They drop their markers right on it. And then the warships come in, they drop their ordnance right on top of the markers. So these are actual photos taken of those attacks. And this is some of the material that came to the surface. This is Commander Framsdorf cap. These are Draeger escape lungs, which are individual like Momsen lungs that we use by a U.S. Navy. And they have a rebreather link and a small oxygen tank. And they have, they also had, so it acts as a life float as well. They had one-man life rafts. These are German canteens of fresh water. This is the thing I showed you earlier. That's the flagstaff that was the thing that was sticking out of the back of the conning tower. They fly the German ensign off of that. That was made of wood. That actually floated to the surface. There were pillows. There was all kinds of material that came in from the inside of the ship. So they're pulling up also tons diesel fuel is welling to the surface and large sections of cork, which the Germans used cork to insulate the inside of the submarine. It also reduced the sound signature in and out of the submarine. And it also reduced the buildup of respiration and water on the interior of the submarine, which was constantly dripping down from the interior. So the submarine was May 6th. They depth charged it from May 5th until the morning of May 6th. And at this point, they sent a Navy hard hat diver down, you know, with a big brass helmet, and named Edwin Bokelman. And Edwin Bokelman lands on the conning tower. This is what the submarine looks now. It looked like, this is after 50 years. This is probably 20 years ago. This is what the conning tower looks like now. The attack and the 2 periscope stocks and the pressure hull down here. It's in 130 feet of water with 55 men on board. One body was removed the next day by Edwin Bokelman, who landed on the conning tower and reported that there were numerous undetonated depth charges all over the wreck. What could happen is if he's pulling an umbilical because he's surface supplied, if he were to roll one of those depth charges off and it was set for another few feet and it hit that depth, he would have been killed instantly. So he knew this is nuts. He goes into the conning tower. The hatch is packed with bodies. So the guys are trying to get out of this tube that's 24 inches wide, and they were packed in there like rats with their escape equipment. He grappled his legs around one body, 22-year-old kid. I knew the name. It's escaping me now. He's buried. Well, they buried him at sea in an ecumenical service off of New London, Connecticut. They brought another body up to the surface. Well, he has a grave site in Newport. But so Bokelman is going around the conning tower, and what does he see? He comes up and he identifies the submarine by its number. Now, he couldn't see the colors, but he said, I saw markings. No other submarine has, if you've ever seen this in 93, they wrote this book, an incredible book about this German U-boat that was found off the coast of New Jersey. They called it the U-Who for years. They couldn't identify it. It was until John Chatterton and Richie Kohler, who did the Deep Sea Detective series in the 90s. I used to be on that series all the time with German U-boat operations. They spent years going into the submarine until they finally found some compartment tags that had the number of the submarine. So submarines don't have numbers on them. This was painted on the conning tower. He came up and he said, it's the U-853. And that's how we identified it. Edwin Volkman identified it on May 6th of 1945. Now, later turns out the U.S. Navy knew the entire time the number of the submarine. They actually knew the commander's name is Framsdorf. It took me years afterwards to find out what naval intelligence knew the entire time. But they knew. But Edward Volkman, I got it right in his records, he identifies a U-853, and he got it from the conning tower. And a lot of people, how did he identify it? Well, this is exactly how he identified it. So the U-boat is filled with the remains of the 55 men. For years afterwards, they were going down trying to recover. They thought there were treasures on board because some of the German U-boats had surrendered up down at Portsmouth. There were a number of them, and some of them were carrying strategic materials that were actually heading to Japan, including one that was carrying 1,200 pounds of enriched uranium hexafluoride that was going to the Japanese atomic weapons program. So because of that secretness of them removing that stuff, there were many people in the Navy who saw them removing strange stuff from this one long-range submarine. These submarines were not capable of making it to the Pacific. That particular submarine was. And as a result, there were salvagers that went over the submarine thinking it was carrying treasures of the Third Reich and it had Hitler on board. It wasn't the case. It was simply an operational submarine, but it does have the remains of 50, well, over 50 men. Some had been recovered afterwards. So we, at the time, I was trying to get the Navy to correct the official record of the causality of the loss. And so we decided we have to find the wreck. So we ended up going out and looking for the wreck. This is the way they described the wreck, according to the survivors. The stern went down at more of a 45-degree angle. So there were about 3 dozen survivors that made it up to the depth charge racks. Those are the men who saw the submarine 500 yards away. Only Scagnelli made it out of the bow because it went perpendicular very quickly because of the weight of the machinery. So we were looking at the submarine in 2 pieces. We figured about 100 yards apart. It was 100 yards apart. It's in over 300 feet of water. There's much more degradation of the wreck than this. I mean, they're really pulverized. The deckhouse, because we had dove another Eagle-class ship that was scuttled in Boston Harbor, we knew certain areas of the ship weren't going to be there. We knew the compass stand wasn't going to be there. So we thought about the orientation on the side. So we went out and started conducting side scan sonar operations over the next, it took us 18 years to find this ship because of the rough bottom topography. In the meantime, we were able to get the Navy to come up with some records that they claim were missing from their long-term storage facility. And I fought the Navy for 5 years and found out they were lying the entire time. They not only had 1 copy, they had 3 separate copies, because when we looked at the different copies, there were coffee stains, there were different punch marks, there were staples on others. They had individual handwritten notes from the people who these all belonged to. So there were 3 copies that I can absolutely prove were in existence. But I had to sue the Navy, and they continually lied and said, all of our records are missing from our long-term storage facility. So this is us up in, this is 2000 and I think 1. These are the Westland brothers, Captain Lazinski. This is his ship, Salvage 1. There's Paul Westland, Bob Westland, who just passed away a year ago, myself, Chris Hugo, Scott Ullman of the dive team. But we ended up going back because when we looked for the ship initially, we didn't find a ship. So we kept on searching, and we go back every year or so. And now we had the University of Connecticut on board. The University of New Hampshire allowed us to use their ships. So we had the best vessels and the best people in the world. This is a retired Navy commander who was instrumental in helping us with these searches as well over the years. But we kept going back. This is Marty Klein of Klein Associates, who made the first civilian available side scan sonar. Now we're using not paper, but we're using actual computers that use an algorithm to overlay the mapping. You do it like you're mowing a lawn. You go up and down and up and down. You have to then match the visuals together. And so we had remote operated vehicles on one of these vessels. I think it was the University of Connecticut. This is me diving a target out there. There was actually a boiler. I don't know what it was doing out there. There was some hull plates, but the rest of the ship was missing. And this is May 9th. This is the first day following the surrender on May 7th. 2 days later, it's in the papers. And these are the Westerlands. There's Bob, Paul, Fred, Carol, and Ivar Westerland, their father, who was killed on the ship. And that's their widow. This is within a week of the sinking. And this is them in 2002. Bob, Paul, Fred, Carol, and Ivar's widow, who was still alive at the time, and she actually received the Purple Heart on behalf of her late husband. This is Bernard Cavalcanti, who I used to work with at the Naval Historical Center. Jim Fahey, who was the head of the Mass Military Archives. That's my father, who was a decorated combat vet from World War II, 17th Airborne. Chris Hugo, Commander Bill Glass, who was the captain of the USS Salem. This is on board the Salem when we got the Navy, Gordon England, the Secretary of the Navy, to correct the official record of the causality of the loss of the Eagle 56. It's never happened before. It's only happened once in U.S. naval history. The causality of the loss of a warship from non-enemy action, where they blamed the men of the ship, for negligently blowing up their own ship and killing 49 of their own fellow crewmen. They changed it to enemy action, due to enemy action. That's the title of the book that Steve Puleo came out with. I'm here presenting, this is John Scagnelli, the engineering officer, whose name was ultimately cleared when they determined that it was not his responsibility. Harold Peterson and John Breeze. So 51 men received Purple Hearts, 49 posthumously. And this is Steve Puleo did the first book on this. I met him. He showed up at that award ceremony in July of 2001 on the USS Salem, and he asked me, "You're going to do a book on this?" And at that time, I had no intention on doing it. So he wrote a great book, and it reads more like a novel. It's got a lot more stuff than I was able to write. My writing is very technical. He has stuff about the families and so forth. And one great thing is I asked him, do me a favor. My father was in combat in Europe at the time. Write a chapter on my father and his experiences in Operation Varsity, which he did. My father was thrilled at that. So we got the Purple Hearts for these guys. Finally, we said we have to give something. There's nothing for the men. There's nothing to memorialize them. So immediately we talked to the family members and said, let's do something. Let's get a memorial up there. So you've all been to the lighthouse and you've seen. So at that point, this is when we decided, and we got in touch with the authorities in Cape Elizabeth, and they gave us the authority to be able to put up. So we raised with private funds. We put up the first memorial marker overlooking. It's 290 feet. The lighthouse is over here, as you know, and this is on the cliff walk. And this is the first memorial we put up. This was on the 60th anniversary, and which was great. It was awesome. But, you know, in the interim, we had all been up there. We had a huge ceremony. We had 400 people. We had a great thing at DeMillo's Yacht Club, a dinner. Stephen Puleo at that time, this was a few years after we had the Purple Heart ceremony. So this is the 60th anniversary. So Stephen was there. He had just released his book. He was signing books for all the family members. My father was still alive. Mrs. Westland was still alive. So it was really a great time. And so we had all pretty much forgotten about it until a group of technical wreck divers who I knew started saying, well, you never found the ship. So we didn't have to find the ship. The Secretary of the Navy has already recognized that they knew it was sunk by the German U-boat. We got to look for the ship. I was not in favor of it. The family members were not in favor of it. My side scan sonar guy went and gave them the numbers from our first search. We knew it was in the general location of the first search. It was just missing in the rocks, so we wanted to let things. So they gave them the numbers. They went back out. They dropped the side scan sonar very low. They pulled it very slowly, which is dangerous because you can lose a $70,000 piece of equipment. But they ultimately found these two little anomalies between rock formations. And so this is one of my buddies who went down there, and this is over 300 feet of water. This is like climbing Mount Everest when it comes to technical shipwreck diving. They're using mixed gas rebreathers. And this is Jeff Goudreau. This is the first piece of equipment. It says USN right here. And that's a hand wheel from one of the, pressure valves inside the boiler room. And you can see this is blown into pieces. That's cast steel. So they went and in the debris field, and they found the 4-inch bow deck gun. They found the bow, and they called me, and I was kind of shocked. I knew they were looking for it, and he said, we found the bow section. I asked him any indication to human remains and so forth, because then we had to put the kibosh to it with the Navy. And so they continued to search the area, and this is some of the equipment amidships. This is the bow. It's hard to see here, but there's a giant rock outcropping here, and this is the problem. Side scan sonar doesn't look straight down. It looks sideways. It looks out this way. So if you have, this is a rock outcropping and the ship is down here, if the acoustic shadow covers it, you don't see it. You have to drop it right down. So this is what they found. So this is the 4-inch deck gun is right here. The bow had actually, and you'll see how sharp that is, how knife-like. Like I said, it was designed to actually act as a ram if they could bring a submarine to the surface. And so I think the weight of the cement that was in the bow caused the structural integrity to weaken, and it caused the bow to break off. And this is the deck house. The bridge would have been up here, but this is only the bow half. The stern was 100 yards, exactly 100 yards away. They continued to search for it that entire year until they found the stern section, and then they found the boilers. And the incredible part is, the problem is they've got the photographs of the boilers are copyrighted. The boilers were found sitting right next to each other, perfectly intact. So what happened is the explosion happened amidships, where, and the survivors told me there were these air compressors that were 12-horse gasoline-powered air compressors in a compartment just above and between the boiler room and the engine room. And it was a forced draft system, so it was overpressure. They had to go through an airlock, and it forced the air pressure into the boilers to stoke the boilers. They said that was the loudest part of the ship. When they were in those machinery spaces, they couldn't even hear each other talking. And they used to use sign language in there. So it makes sense. That was dead center amidships, right at, again, 56. It was structural member 56 was right in that area, and that's where the ship exploded. Dead center, right between the engine room and the boiler room, right where those two loud air compressors were. So that was 2018. We found the ship. Smithsonian Channel did a documentary. There was still some family that was still interested. I said, one last thing we got to do. Let's put another monument up there with the names of the men. Nothing has the names of the men. So it was coming up to the 70th anniversary. And, you know, we wanted to do this, so we raised the money again, and I was unable to come up here because we had all kinds of restrictions. So I called Steve, Steve had contacted me a couple of years earlier, Steve Lyons, who's your resident historian up here. And I said, Steve, can you help me out with this? So he was the one that contacted the people at the foundry, talked to the masons to do the base work, and also to the local authorities up here to get the authorization, because you need their authorization for perpetual care and so forth to be able to get this stuff done. Because we were going to have another ceremony. We were going to have family members up here. Because of COVID, we weren't able to do it. And it's been up here for how many, like 4 years, Steve? Yeah. And I only saw it May 2nd when I came up with the Coast Defense Study Group. It was the first time I saw this. So we finally were able to put this monument up. They did send some Navy personnel. This is still under COVID. So we did have an honor. And Steve, were you there for this? So Steve was there. I couldn't be there because I was out of state. They would have made me sit in a hotel room for 14 days before I could be seen with a gas mask on. But this is the second memorial that we put right next to it, and fitting, it has all of the names of the men who were killed, the officers, the enlisted men who were killed, the officer survivor, John Scagnelli, and the enlisted survivors, all of whom had since passed away. And as you've seen them, they're right next to each other. And then we were able to take the bricks that were around it, and we put in some nice granite curbstones around it, so it looks much nicer. But we want to come out and finish it off to remove the dirt that's inside, and maybe put some masonry and some stonework on top, so it's a little more permanent and looks a little nicer. But it's an awesome monument, and it's really the last thing to tell people that one of the last major battles of World War II, the Battle of the Atlantic, was the greatest naval battle in world history. It lasted 5 years and 8 months. Over 80,000 people lost their life, about 3,000 ships, including over 2,800 merchant freighters, transports, and tankers, over 700 German U-boats, 700 American ships of different sizes, 176 Allied warships. It was the greatest naval battle of all history. And it really started right off the American Northeast coast, and it ended right off the American Northeast coast. This was the last major chapter in the Battle of the Atlantic. It was fought within 9 miles of where we are right here. So it's something that people have to remember, and if you can keep it alive with your family members, your kids, your grandchildren, let them know how close World War II is, how close all wars are at any given time. People don't know. You always think, well, these things happen great distances away. We learned that, repeatedly, that things that happen farther away, now with modern technology, they end up a lot closer. So beautiful spot. And as I said, we're hoping, hopefully next summer, we might be able to put some little nicer trim around the foundation here and put in some nice masonry. That was the book that I came out with. This is more of a technical read. If you want a really good read, more like a novel, you want Stephen Puglio's book. Something that this would make your eyes cross. This is somebody that, if you go to the Naval, if you're an Annapolis graduate, you'd find this more interesting. But I want to thank you again for the invitation, and thanks, Steve, and all of you guys. Sorry for keeping you guys so long. Any questions?
Yeah, just curious with the boiler explosion implies negligence or training or whatever. Why would they steer it in that direction?
Yeah, I thought about it a lot, and initially when I first came about, I was thinking, wow, this is high level. And then the more I thought about it, the more I realized it wasn't high level at all. It was very low level. It was the lowest possible level. It was the base commander of the Portland Naval Base, a guy named Ernest Freeman. And you got to put yourself in his perspective. Everybody's waiting for the end of the war, waiting for news of Hitler's death or capture by the Russians, German surrender. They're already working on moving major naval assets to the Pacific Theater because they knew the Japanese weren't anywhere near capitulation. So this was not, in my opinion, it's a small warship that is not a significant ship. It's not like the Indianapolis or a major combatant, small little combatant that's doing really minor operations, towing targets, has a very small crew. It was very insignificant to the higher level naval command, but was very important to Ernest Freeman. Close to a major war base at the last days of the war, bristling with naval defenses. It's one of the last jump-off points before Halifax, where the convoys is still going over to the European theater. There's a lot of activity here. And within 12 days of Germany's surrender, to have a German submarine come that close in and sink a warship and then escape detection. And it wasn't his hunter-killer group. It wasn't 60.3. It was another independent hunter-killer group off of Rhode Island that ultimately hunted it down and sank it. You're getting the same resistance from the people down in Rhode Island when that aircraft came in. They said, we saw a German U-boat out there. So completely dismissed it out of hand. There were no German U-boats in these waters. It's the end of the war. 2 days ago, Karl Dönitz radioed to cease hostile action against Allied shipping. Well, there's still U-boat commanders out there. And I don't know whether Framsdorf had a mechanical malfunction and just simply didn't pick up that radio transmission, though it was repeated on a regular basis. But he could have undergone some damage to his aerials, which are the jumping wires that go from the conning tower to the bow and the stern. That's how they pick up signals. They still would have had to have come to the surface to pick up a radio signal, but they would have done that regularly anyway to ventilate their boat, though it was a snorkel boat. So they would have spent significant time submerged anyway. I don't know, but in my assessment, it was Ernest Freeman. He handpicked a couple of guys, these 90-day wonders. He told them, you're going to hold, because we know the court of inquiry didn't actually happen. It was a complete and total dog and pony show. It was made up. And according to everyone involved, there was no court of inquiry. And when I got it, the transcript doesn't read. I've done hundreds of trials. You read a trial transcript, it makes sense. It goes chronologically. You have direct examination, cross-examination. It was none of that. And when I read it, I said, this is an absolute farce. It doesn't even look like it. Doesn't even purport to look like a court of inquiry. That's why the Navy didn't want those documents falling into my hands, because it would have been immediately apparent to anyone that read those documents that there was no court of inquiry. And the three survivors said there was no court of inquiry. Alice Hultgren told me there was no court of inquiry. So that's what happened. It was a low-level guy trying to cover his own reputation the final days of the war. And the funny thing was, his findings went up to a guy named Felix Gygax, who was the rear admiral at the 1st Naval District out of Boston. And Felix Gygax looked at the opinion. He said, I find that there is, this is almost an exact quote, I find that there is at least equal evidence to support the theory of an external underwater explosion consistent with an enemy mine or torpedo. However, he approved it. So he acknowledged that it could have been, but the evidence pointed to an external explosion of an enemy nature, but he signed off on it anyway. And that's why those men were denied Purple Heart medals. And it continued. And even when in 89, when I was petitioning the Navy, they said the official findings are, it was negligent boiler explosion. It was not enemy action. That's why Stephen Puleo, the title to his book is Due to Enemy Action. That was the difference. Wasn't negligence. It was a result of combat with the enemy. There was. Alice Hultgren had a friend who was a retired staff officer, flag officer in the Navy, who came up with the initial copy. Then we had Congressman Joe Moakley, who was dying of cancer. He died about a month or so after. He petitioned the Navy. We got another copy. And we got a third copy. That was the one that was delivered without any other indicia. There was no return address. So when I looked at them, they were all clearly, they were the exact same pages. Hold them up, they're exact same print. However, the thing that was different was they all had different handwriting. It was contemporary handwriting from whoever was reviewing the documents. One of them had clearly, they looked like coffee stains from the ring of they had punch marks that weren't in line with others. There were staple holes that weren't in line with others. There were just stains and tears in the paper that any type of document that you'd find after 70 years. So there were clearly 3 separate documents. There may have been more, but the Navy said they were all missing from their long-term storage facility. And I knew that was not the case. I went down to National Archives at College Park, Maryland, where they should have had records. And at the time, Barry Zerby, who was my friend down there, who was getting me the documents, he said, yeah, it's kind of strange. He said there were some other documents he found. So I get the deck logs and battle of other warships that were involved. And every time I'd go through, they'd refer to maybe another ship in that Hunter-Killer group. Hunter-Killer 60.3 would mention the destroyer, the Woolsey. And then, so I kept on going back and say, look, there were 2 other ships that were involved. There were other aircraft. It kept on going for years. It went on for 5 years. And it takes a couple of months of turnaround time before other records will come. They might refer to another ship, but I pieced together all the records. And that's what my book was based on, a document that I had to submit to the Secretary of the Navy. It had to be footnoted, and every single word had to come out of official records or witness statements. There was not an if, but, or that did not come out of official documents. And that's why when I submitted it, it's a very short document. It's only about 120 pages long. I couldn't put in any artistic license, where Steve Puleo talked to people, and, this guy, the last letter he sent to his wife or his fiance before he went out on that day on the ship, and it read more like a novel. It's a much more pleasant book to read. Mind, if you want to know the terminal velocity of a Type 5 acoustic homing torpedo, the makeup of the warhead, what exactly happened to the ship mechanically, and so forth. But like I said, your eyes will cross immediately and you'll say, what the hell is this?
I think there are a lot of mysteries.
Well, it was my favorite area of research, but also 2 of my friends' father died on it. And so the 2 things converged. But I was just reading the other day about a ship. It was like the Rona, something like that. It was in the Mediterranean. It was a transport, British transport. Over 1,000 men were killed on it. They claim it was the largest loss apparently people didn't know about it until 2018. And the 80th anniversary was lost in 43. It was November 26th, I think. I just read about this the other day. I'd never heard about this ship. The 80th anniversary is coming up.
Motivate the government it's a lot. We have just like my friend's
Yeah.
father's submarine that was lost, there was no explanation, but
Yeah.
what would motivate the government?
You know, there were a lot, yeah, but there were so many cases like this. I mean, the K-14 case that happened right off Monhegan Island, 1944. I gave you the file on that one. I mean, that's still a mystery to this day. I don't think it's so much of a mystery, but there were a lot of cases. There were 3 ships off the coast of England that were lost in preparation of D-Day, with like 1,500 men that was sunk by German E-boats during a preparation landing. That was kept secret for 60 plus years. And those are now, so these things occasionally pop up, and you're talking hundreds of men, thousands of men, that for some reason the naval authorities or the military authorities don't want people to know about. What they do is they took all those names of those casualties. They didn't tell the family members that those men were killed in a training exercise, and they were just added to the casualties of the D-Day landings. Family members didn't know for 65 years. Was off the southeast coast of England. And, you know, so there are more of these cases that occur all the time. But like I said, I never heard of this case, the Rona or whatever. I think it's the Rona. It was a HMT, I believe. It was a transport. It was in the Mediterranean. It was sunk off of Algeria with well over 1,000 men. And I just read about this like yesterday, the day before. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I interviewed dozens of German U-boat commanders that survived the war. As a matter of fact, it was Reinhard Hartigan sank the first 2 ships in 1940, January of 42. So I'll be over in 1 sec. I just want to, Reinhard Hartigan just died a couple of years ago at 100, I think he was 103 years old, maybe within the last 5 years. I met Reinhard Hartigan, talked to him. He sank the first 2 ships, the Norness and the Coimbra, off of New York in January of 42. He departed Germany in anticipation of the attacks on Pearl Harbor. A lot of people don't know that. The Germans were in collaboration with so he was here at the time. He was coming over to the American East Coast to sink Allied American shipping in anticipation of the attacks on Pearl Harbor and the declaration of war, which I think happened the day after Roosevelt declared war on Japan. I think was within a day or so that Hitler declared war on the United States. So it's incredible. They were working in full collaboration, and that's how early they were sinking ships. You look back in World War I, there were German U-boats operating out here in World War I. Right in the Gulf of Maine, there was the 156, a giant U-boat, was larger than anything in World War II. They were operating with impunity out here. The crazy thing we don't know is, most people don't know, is until we entered the war in late 1917, we were trading with the Germans, and we had German submarines coming into places like Baltimore, Maryland with strategic materials, and we were sending them back with strategic materials that they were using to wage war against the French and the English, who are our allies. And that's absolutely true. The Deutschland class submarines. So, you know, history is very strange. Yep. All set, guys. Thank you, guys. Yeah, thanks.